by the Simmons Anti-Racism Working Group. We're a group of students, faculty, and staff who create events and discussion around the subjects of race and racism in the LIS field. After this kickoff event, we're beginning a series focused on racism in specific areas of LIS. The next one will be held Thursday, November 14th, 4:30 to 6 p.m. And if we can get your contact information on the sign-up sheet that's going around, we'll be happy to let you know about it. And they'll also go out on this, the general events listers. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Lisa Hussey. Lisa Hussey joined the GSLIS faculty in fall of 2008. She was formerly the Director of Library Services at DeVry University in Arizona and has taught at the University of British Columbia and the University of Missouri, where she received her doctoral degree. She also served as Program Manager for the University of Arizona School of Information Resources and Library Science. She acts as the Faculty Advisor for the Progressive Librarians Guild here. And Professor Hussey has presented widely on diversity and librarianship and is a longstanding advocate for social justice within the field. Thank you, Professor, for joining us.
Thank you. So, for those of you who had me in class, it's going to be unusual because I don't actually have a pretty slideshow to go with this because I thought I would make this a little bit more informal, just kind of talk a little bit and give you guys a chance to ask questions and kind of bring some of this up. And, kind of as this was titled, is like, why do we need to talk about racism? And one of the things I kind of want to start by talking about is, when we think about racism, a lot of times the first thing that comes to mind are the images of the civil rights movement, and the Jim Crow laws, and these horrible things that we think that we've gotten past in society. We have gotten very much past overt racism. When it happens now, most people have that kind of horrible reaction to it, like that's wrong, that's not something you should be doing. However, that doesn't mean that racism is anywhere near gone from our society, and it's become much more subtle and much more difficult sometimes to understand and recognize the barriers that are getting put up. I mean, one of the perfect examples is we're a profession that's 85% white. And I actually think that number has creeped up a little bit since the one traditionally African-American college that actually had a program closed it back in 2006, Clark Atlanta. And actually Clark Atlanta at one time was responsible for 10% of the entire ethnic minority librarian population. So that was kind of a very significant loss. But kind of with those things in mind, I want to kind of give you a little bit about my background, kind of some details that I've pulled out, because I am a librarian, so I went to the census. Made a point of finding some of this information. But just, kind of give you a little bit of my background. For those of you who haven't ever done research into why people have become librarians or who librarians are, like perhaps your professor who did that as your dissertation, I'm actually the poster child for librarianship. I mean, seriously. I am white, I am middle class, I come from a highly educated family. The vast majority of librarians fall into this category. We also tend to have liberal arts educations, and I do history. So I really do kind of fit all of these things. Again, we have the tradition of librarians being kind of having a liberal bent. And again, if you've ever been in class with me, you know this is very much the case. And another thing that I kind of want to mention about my own upbringing was that I really wasn't taught to judge or see people by their race or their religion or, any of those things that we try not to do. However, despite all of that, the reality is I was brought up in white culture. I was brought up in a white family. I was brought up in a family that was middle class and educated. I grew up on a suburb on the South Shore here of Boston. How many of you guys have ever been to Hull or Nantasket? Yes. Yeah. In my entire town, there was a black family. Literally one family. And by the way, they did not identify as black or African American. They were Portuguese. And that was something that I remember the person who was in my class saying that more than once. Obviously, I graduated from high school just a couple of years ago. And it has stuck with me all this time that this was a distinction she was very clear about. So that tells you about kind of what the expectations were to conform within that town. And within, the kind of area that I grew up in. Believe it or not, I was blessed because my parents were divorced. That's going to sound weird, but I spent summers with my father in New Mexico and San Diego. So I was actually kind of introduced to some different cultures or points of view at some point, you know, kind of growing up as I was going through. But ultimately, regardless, a lot of how I view the world, and I have expectations, and I make my judgments, are based on that culture I was raised in. And this is one of the issues we have to deal with racism in modern times, is that we are often doing this from within that context and don't recognize it. I'll get back to that in a minute. I just kind of want to give you guys a couple of reasons why this is important. I mean, you guys obviously all think this is important, you're here. But let me reinforce that, because again, I found the statistics, I want to share them with you. Looking at the data from the 2010 census, the population is getting older. In other words, we're living longer. And the baby boomers are starting to get, I'm sure you guys have all heard that phrase, the baby boomers. That's why none of us are going to have Social Security, except Linda. Yeah, but that, people are living longer. So people are getting older, so that we're starting to have a really kind of change in that demographic. That in and of itself is something we have to think about as we serve people in the future. As because again, libraries, archives, LIS, we're service organizations. This is something that matters greatly. Immigration in the United States, we have a lot more people immigrating into the United States than emigrating. By the way, this includes both legal and illegal immigration. But it's something like for every one person that emigrates, 3 people come in. Which is a good balance, because we're actually not, despite shows like 19 Kids and Counting, we are not actually replacing ourselves. Our birth rate is actually less than 1 for 1 in the United States. So this is how we kind of make up for it, because our population is growing like that. But this is kind of where the big thing comes in. Within the population, those who identify as one race, and I should point out that just over 1% identify as 2 or more races. That keeps changing with each new census. I think one of the reasons why those numbers are so low is because you guys have filled out a census, right? Is it easy to find these kinds of things? No, and they don't make it very easy either when you're kind of looking at things. But in that, 74% of the population is white, 12.36% of the population is Black or African American, 4.38% is Asian, which, by the way, I love that broad term, Asian. If you think about the continent of Asia and what that covers.
Yeah, that includes Russia, right?
Parts of it, yes. Everything west of the Ural Mountains, it includes. No, wait, yes, east, sorry. Almost 1% identifies Native American, 0.15% is Pacific Islander or Hawaiian, and then 5.63% is other. And they don't list what that other is. But I actually have a friend who is Arab American. And she's actually usually very annoyed that there's not a fill in the dot for herself. And she writes it in every year. And of course I do Hispanic Latino separate from this, just to make it really difficult to try to understand. But just to give you some idea, by the year 2050, Hispanic Latino, people who identify as Hispanic Latino are expected to become about 30% of the population. So we're seeing a really kind of change in demographics. We're seeing a huge change in who we're serving. But I think one of the really interesting things is in this latest census, 21% of those who answered speak a language other than English in the home. And one of the other things I thought was kind of interesting as I'm reading this report, they were trying to come up with reasons why, and one of the things they said is people might have difficulty assimilating to American culture. Does anybody have an issue with the term with the phrase I just used? I'm sorry, Letty, you were nodding, so
Well, in my household we speak English and Spanish, but I'm Puerto Rican and we just speak both languages in Puerto Rico and here, so it's just natural.
Yeah. The other thing there, the term assimilation, it's the word. I'm sorry, but I can't help but think of that when I hear it at this point. But this is one of the reasons why we need to talk about racism when you're talking about LIS. Because there's this idea of assimilation into American culture. What defines American culture?
Well, theoretically, American culture would be defined by the American population. But
is that actually how we think we define it?
no.
Yeah. When I talk about assimilation, what standards are we trying to get people to assimilate to? Who defines those standards? What defines what is seen as the acceptable standards of behavior in U.S. culture?
I don't have the answer to that one, but just the word assimilation, I hadn't thought of it before. It sort of almost means they're giving something up to be more the same like everybody else. Never thought of it that way, but it's giving up something.
Yeah.
If you're assimilating.
When you're assimilating,
You give something up.
you're subsuming your identity into another. You know, that's a very important thing to think about, because how many of you have grandparents or parents who have been here for less than, who perhaps are the first generation or actually immigrated to the United States? Okay. How many, I mean, Letty already talked about her family speaks Spanish at home. How many of you grew up with another language in your household? Okay. And then say my grandmothers were first generation Norwegians. One of my grandmothers couldn't speak a word of it, the other one was just from what she learned from her grandfather because their parents made sure they learned English and became American. Now, we're talking about still a very white culture, but that's something that is kind of part of it. They gave up their language. You know, they still kept many of the other pieces of the culture, but that was kind of a part of it. And you're seeing now the trend as more, you know, as you have more immigrants, that's not something they're willing to give up. And there's something about the standard that they're supposed to. And you think about who's defining what that standard is in our society. And it's, you know, to borrow a word from Gramsci, it's the prevailing cultural hegemony. You know, what that means is that it's, you know, it's the culture that defines things. It's what defines acceptable behaviors, what defines success in this country. I mean, if I ask you what defines success in the U.S., what would you guys say?
Your own house.
Yes, yeah. Owning property, that's a big one. A big paycheck. You know, being successful as an individual. Those are all very strongly values that come from a very, I want to say, a very Western European, ethnically white view. We focus on the individual a lot. And that's kind of one of the things. This is what sets the standards, you know, this idea of what's seen as successful. I mean, being educated is seen as successful. Does that mean people who don't have an education couldn't possibly be successful? No, but we view it that way. You know, making a lot of money is seen as being successful. So those of you who are going into library science, you are inherently being unsuccessful. You know, but people will see you as successful, but doesn't always kind of seem to be tempered with this idea that you gave something up. That by choosing to do this, it should be admired that somehow you gave up the possibility to be even more successful. I mean, these are things that can kind of be a part of this. And again, this is, you know, it's these assumptions, it's these prevailing ideas, these mores that kind of underlie our society. This creates a lot of what you see as, I want to say, the subtle racism that feeds into things. If you don't fit these cultural stereotypes or these cultural mores, then you don't necessarily, you know, be seen as successful, be seen as I don't want to say acceptable, but, you know, to be seen as part of something. You know, either you're, and let me ask you this, if people don't fit into this, do we look for answers often beyond they made the choice not to? This is something that comes up a lot. I mean, please, in the current rhetoric today, in politics, do any of you guys watch the news until you want to punch something? For me, that usually takes about 30 seconds. But, you know, I mean, it's like, it's talking about choices. You know, about people making choices not to do something. And is that always a honest way of looking at it? You know, no, I mean, it's really not. It's like, well, they made the choice not to finish high school. Is it really a choice if you're working 40 or 80 hours a week to help support your family? You know, is it a choice where your high school is more dangerous to go to than it is to stay home? Or is it a choice where, you know, I mean, you may finish high school, but Lord knows you didn't get the education that would even get you to community college, never mind beyond? You know, one of the things that underlies one of the issues in our society, and this is kind of a big one, is that everybody starts from a level playing field. And we don't. And that's kind of a really big issue. We don't start from a level playing field. I mean, everybody in this room didn't start from the same place.